How do colonial legacies impact indigenous economies? Imagine a world where traditional ways of making a living are suddenly replaced or heavily altered. That's what happened to many indigenous communities because of colonial legacies. When European powers arrived, they didn't just take land, they changed entire economic systems. Indigenous economies before contact were often built on sharing, reciprocity, and community cooperation. They relied on systems of gift-giving and redistribution that kept resources flowing and social bonds strong. These systems helped communities survive tough times and maintain harmony. They also had their own trade routes and markets, which operated independently of European influence. Colonial powers quickly reorganized these economies to serve their own needs. They often installed new leaders who were loyal to the colonizers, making it easier to control local resources. The focus shifted to extracting raw materials like gold, diamonds, cotton, and sugar for export. This meant indigenous farmers and craft workers lost access to their land and traditional ways of production. Instead of growing food for their communities, many were forced into labor on plantations or mines. Land that once belonged to communities was enclosed and turned into private property, breaking up communal holdings. This disrupted their social and economic ties, making it harder for them to sustain themselves. Colonial governments often didn't give indigenous peoples full ownership of their land. They held it in trust, which limited their control and sovereignty. Boundaries were redrawn, excluding indigenous access to vital resources like minerals, oil, and fertile land. Laws like the Dawes Act in the United States fragmented tribal landholdings, further weakening indigenous control. These policies made it difficult for indigenous communities to develop their economies or maintain their cultural practices tied to land use. Environmental damage was another consequence. Overhunting of whales and other species used for food and materials caused ecological imbalances. This environmental harm made it even harder for indigenous communities to sustain their traditional economies. Today, these legacies still influence indigenous economies. Many communities face ongoing restrictions on land rights, limited access to resources, and economic marginalization. Governments and corporations often control resource extraction, leaving indigenous peoples with fewer opportunities for economic growth. Efforts to rebuild indigenous economies focus on reclaiming land rights, protecting cultural practices, and developing sustainable models rooted in indigenous knowledge. These communities are working to regain control over their resources and create economic systems that respect their traditions and environment. Colonial legacies have reshaped indigenous economies by dismantling traditional systems, pushing for resource extraction, and restricting land rights. Recognizing these impacts helps us understand the ongoing challenges indigenous communities face and the importance of supporting their efforts for economic independence.